Thomas Jefferson, the pen, the paradox, and the president. Chapter 1. A boy from Shadwell. In the gentle rolling hills of Virginia, nestled near the banks of the Rivanna River, a boy was born into privilege, expectation, and a new world of promise. His name, Thomas Jefferson. Born on the 13th of April 1743 in a modest yet dignified plantation called Shadwell, young Thomas was the third of 10 children in a prosperous family. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a surveyor, a planter, and a man of few words but firm principles. His mother, Jane Randolph, descended from one of the most prominent families in Virginia. Thomas, shy and introspective, found refuge in books. While other boys chased deer or played games in the fields, Thomas pored over volumes of Cicero, Homer, and Locke. The Enlightenment wasn't just a distant European ideal, it lived in his thoughts, his writing, and eventually, his nation. Even as a child, Jefferson was a paradox. He loved silence, yet played the violin with passion. He was a Virginian aristocrat, yet dreamed of equality. He believed in liberty, yet was raised on a plantation dependent on the toil of enslaved Africans. His world was ripe with contradiction, and he, unknowingly, was destined to become its most eloquent and conflicted voice. Chapter 2. The Making of a Mind. By age 14, Jefferson had inherited over 5,000 acres of land and dozens of enslaved people after his father's sudden death. He was sent to the College of William and Mary, where he studied philosophy, science, literature, and law. He rose before dawn, studied for 15 hours a day, and walked with his law mentor George Wythe beneath the ancient trees of Williamsburg. He spoke French, read Latin and Greek, and even studied architecture. Everything fascinated him. But amid his intellectual pursuits, the reality of slavery remained. While he read about liberty and justice in the pages of Locke and Montesquieu, the voices of his enslaved laborers echoed in the background. He never questioned their presence yet. The contradiction festered, unspoken. He would become a lawyer, then a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. But the pen would always be his weapon. He knew how to wield words like sword-sharp, elegant, and deadly. Chapter 3. Penning a Revolution. Philadelphia. The air was thick with anticipation. Delegates from 13 colonies gathered in a hot, stuffy room. The call for independence was no longer a whisper, it was a thunderclap. It was John Adams, brash and bold from Massachusetts, who insisted that Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence. "You can write 10 times better than I can," Adams had said. "You are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business." Jefferson retreated to a quiet room at 7th and Market Streets. There, with a quill and parchment, he began writing what would become the most famous document in American history. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." He wrote of inalienable rights, of liberty and life, of the tyrannies of King George. Yet, as his hand flowed with ideals, he knew the irony. Back home, men and women in chains worked his fields. He wrote for their freedom, yet not for them. When the Declaration was presented to Congress, it was edited, debated, and stripped of some of Jefferson's most passionate condemnations, especially the passages criticizing the slave trade. Still, his voice prevailed. He was 33 years old. Chapter 4. Brothers in Rebellion, Foes in Politics. Jefferson and Adams had fought the British together, but peace brought politics, and politics brought division. Adams was pragmatic, a believer in a strong central government. Jefferson, an idealist, feared tyranny and favored the power of the states. Their visions clashed and the friendship frayed. Jefferson served as Secretary of State under President Washington, while Adams became Vice President. The differences between Federalists and Democratic Republicans deepened. Jefferson viewed Adams as monarchic, too close to British ideals. Adams saw Jefferson's followers as dangerous revolutionaries, flirting with the chaos of France. Then came the election of 1796. Adams won. Jefferson came in second and thus became vice president, a quirk of the Electoral College at the time. They barely spoke. Chapter 5. The election of 1800, the revolution of principles. The year was 1800. The American experiment stood on a knife's edge. The Federalists, led by President John Adams, were under attack. The Alien and Sedition Acts passed under Adams' administration allowed the government to silence dissent and imprison critics. Jefferson, now the leading voice of the Democratic Republicans, saw these laws as a betrayal of the very liberties the Revolution had fought for. The campaign turned bitter personal insults flew. Adams was called a tyrant, a monarchist. Jefferson was branded an atheist, a dangerous radical who would usher in chaos. The country split North versus South, merchants versus farmers, Federalists versus Republicans. In a twist of constitutional fate, Jefferson tied with his own running mate Aaron Burr. The election was thrown into the House of Representatives. Weeks of tension followed. Ballot after ballot, the votes stalled. Rumors of civil war spread. Then, in a quiet backroom maneuver, some say, with subtle urging from Alexander Hamilton, enough Federalists abstained. Jefferson was declared president. Burr became vice president. Jefferson called the moment a revolution of 1,800, a peaceful transfer of power between parties. In the world of kings and coups, it was revolutionary indeed. But the wounds ran deep. His friendship with Adams lay in ruins, frozen by betrayal and bitterness. Chapter Y, the president who wanted less power. As president, Jefferson arrived in Washington in 1801, not in a royal carriage but on horseback. He wore no wig, dressed simply, and even greeted visitors without ceremony. He wanted to dismantle the trappings of power, not embrace them. He cut government spending, reduced the military, and shrank the national debt. He believed America should be a nation of farmers, not bankers. He envisioned a republic of virtue, sustained by free men, small government, and individual liberty. But liberty for whom? On his plantation, Monticello, enslaved men and women continued to labor. He recorded their names in neat ledgers: Sally, James, Edith, Isaac. He built inventions to make life more efficient. But he never designed freedom for the enslaved. Chapter 7, the Louisiana Purchase, a contradiction of constitutionalism. In 1803, Jefferson was presented with a gift too grand to refuse. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing funds for war, offered to sell France's vast Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. The purchase would double the size of the nation, but there was a catch. Nowhere in the Constitution did it explicitly say the president could acquire new land. Jefferson, the strict constitutionalist, faced a dilemma. He hesitated. He wrote letters, he debated with himself, and then he acted. He justified the purchase as necessary for national security and the survival of the Republic. With a stroke of a pen, he contradicted his lifelong defense of limited federal power. The Louisiana Purchase made America an empire of land. It also set the stage for more slavery, more displacement of native peoples, and more questions Jefferson would struggle to answer. Chapter 8. The Hemmings question. Among the most painful paradoxes of Jefferson's life was the matter of Sally Hemings. Sally was the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife, Martha. Both shared the same white father, John Wales. Sally, however, was enslaved. In Paris, while Jefferson served as ambassador to France, Sally accompanied his youngest daughter. There, in the City of Light, began a relationship that would last decades and bear children, some say 6, possibly more. Sally Hemings lived at Monticello. Her children were lighter-skinned. Some passed into white society. Jefferson never publicly acknowledged them, but he quietly freed them in his Villa Rare Act. Was it love? Was it coercion? History offers no clear answer. Jefferson was in his 40s, Sally in her teens. He was her owner. The power dynamic was undeniable. To this day, it remains one of the greatest contradictions of the man who wrote, "All men are created equal." Chapter 9. Silent rivalry, loud legacy. While Jefferson governed, John Adams retreated in silence to his farm in Quincy. The two men did not speak for years. Jefferson's second term was marked by trade embargoes, partisan battles, and growing tension with Britain. His ideal of a small government clashed with the realities of global politics. He chose not to run for a third term. He returned to Monticello, weary but proud. "I have done for my country all that I could," he said. But something lingered, a wound not healed. A friendship not buried but not reborn either, until a letter came, Chapter X, a letter from Quincy. It began with ink. In 1812, 7 years after Jefferson left the presidency, he received a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, steady, slanted, firm. It was from John Adams. The ice cracked. What followed was one of the most extraordinary literary dialogues in American history. A 14-year correspondence between two men who had once fought side by side, then stood on opposite shores of philosophy, and now found common ground in old age. They wrote of liberty, religion, revolution, education, and aging. They joked, they confessed, they remembered. Their letters were both brilliant and heartbreaking, filled with wisdom, irony, and the melancholy of men watching the world they built change without them. Jefferson wrote, "It is a comfort to interchange thoughts with an old friend." Adams replied, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." In their final years, the fire of rivalry became a flame of respect. Chapter XI, Monticello, the paradox on the mountain. Jefferson's beloved home, Monticello, stood as a symbol of his genius and his contradictions. He designed it himself, inspired by Palladian architecture, Roman temples, and Enlightenment symmetry. With dome, porticos, and classical columns, it was a living testament to reason and order. Inside, the home was filled with books, inventions, fossils, telescopes, and Native American artifacts. He called it his essay in architecture. Outside, life told another story. Monticello was worked by over 600 enslaved people during Jefferson's lifetime. He recorded their births, labor, marriages, and deaths, sometimes with cold precision, sometimes with melancholy distance. His slaves cooked his meals, sewed his clothes, built his house, and raised his children. He knew slavery was wrong. He wrote it poisoned the soul, degraded the master, and destroyed the slave. Yet, he freed only a few in his lifetime. He was, as he once wrote, a walking contradiction. Chapter 12, The Decline of a Statesman. As Jefferson aged, his debts mounted. He had lived beyond his means: lavish entertainment, costly books, European wine, architectural experiments. The plantation no longer yielded enough profit. The War of 1812 devastated Virginia's economy. Jefferson sold Booksh's priceless library of over 6,000 volumes to the federal government. It became the core of the Library of Congress. He said, "I cannot live without books," but gave them up for the good of the nation. Physically, he declined. Rheumatism bent his spine. He walked with a cane, yet his mind remained sharp, his letters eloquent. He corresponded with presidents and peasants, scientists and scholars. He wrote about agriculture, law, and science. He dreamed of an empire of liberty spreading across the continent. He still believed in education as the foundation of democracy. But he knew time was short. Chapter 3, Farewell to the Republic. In 1825, Jefferson watched with pride as the University of Virginia, his final dream, opened its doors. No church, no king, no dogma, just knowledge. He had designed the curriculum, the buildings, the philosophy. He called it the hobby of my old age, the favorite of my heart. A year later, he fell gravely ill. By July of 1826, Jefferson was confined to bed. He knew the end was near. Still, he asked, "Is it the fourth?" It was chapter 14, The Final Paradox. On the 4th of July, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson died at Monticello. He was 83 years old. 5 hours later, in Quincy, Massachusetts, John Adams also died. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." But Jefferson was already gone. Two founding fathers, two rivals, two friends, united again in death on the birthday of the republic they had created. Chapter 15, The Legacy in Stone and Shadow. On his tombstone, Jefferson instructed only 3 achievements be inscribed: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, father of the University of Virginia. No mention of the presidency, no mention of empire, of war, or of Monticello. He wanted to be remembered not for the power he held, but for the ideas he gave the world. Yet history remembers more. He was a man of soaring words and quiet contradictions. He inspired revolutions, yet owned slaves. He preached liberty, but maintained inequality. He believed in the people, yet feared the mob. He was brilliant. He was flawed. He was human. Chapter 16. Words that outlive the man. Long after Jefferson's body rested beneath the red soil of Monticello, his words lived on. The Declaration of Independence became more than a document, it became a creed. Its opening lines inspired abolitionists, suffragettes, civil rights activists, and democracy movements around the globe. Frederick Douglass, the famed abolitionist, once called the Declaration a glorious liberty document. Though Douglass condemned Jefferson's slaveholding, he still clung to Jefferson's promise that all men are created equal. Abraham Lincoln, facing the fracture of the Union, returned to Jefferson's ideals again and again. He called Jefferson the most distinguished politician of our history for placing equality as the cornerstone of American democracy. Around the world, from Poland to Ghana to Vietnam, revolutionaries echoed Jefferson's lines. His words had become universal ammunition against tyranny. But the man behind them remained tangled in his own chains of contradiction. Chapter XVI, a contradiction written in stone. By the mid-20th century, a new generation of scholars and citizens began to revisit Jefferson's legacy not as hagiography, but with critical eyes. How could the same man who wrote against tyranny over the mind of man be the owner of over 600 enslaved individuals? How could a man who drafted a bill for religious liberty not fight harder for human liberty? How could a philosopher who praised reason and justice justify racial inequality as part of the natural order? The Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. stands as a temple to enlightenment, yet outside its neoclassical dome, protests have formed. Scholars debate whether he should be revered or rebuked. Was he a hypocrite? A product of his time? A genius who fell short? Or a revolutionary who never fully revolted against his own privilege? The answer, as always with Jefferson, is not simple. It is layered, uneasy, real. Chapter 18. The Hemings Legacy. In 1998, a study using DNA evidence confirmed what had long been whispered and denied. Thomas Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings. For centuries, white historians had dismissed the oral history of the Hemings family as rumor. Jefferson's defenders claimed it was slander spread by political enemies. But the truth endured in bones, bloodlines, and memories. The Monticello Foundation eventually acknowledged the relationship. Today, descendants of Jefferson and Hemings stand side by side in family reunions. Their very presence is a living testimony to the complexity of American identity. Jefferson's black descendants tell a different story of dignity denied and truth hidden, yet many of them also speak with pride of their connection to the man who penned America's foundational ideals. The contradiction became inheritance. Chapter XE, the pen versus the whip. In private, Jefferson wrote about the moral depravity of slavery. He admitted that slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears, dangerous to hold, but deadly to let go. And yet, he held on. He freed only a handful of enslaved people during his life, mostly members of the Hemings family. He did not support large-scale emancipation. He feared the chaos it might bring. He envisioned colonization's scheme ascending freed slaves to Africa rather than allowing them full citizenship. In letters, he theorized about the inferiority of black people's stain upon his Enlightenment values. To some, these words mark him as a racist. To others, they show a man imprisoned by the world he helped shape. His pen offered liberty. His plantation practiced bondage. Chapter XX, Adams and Jefferson, a final philosophical dance. Their friendship, once broken by war and politics, became one of the most beautiful correspondences in the history of letters. Adams, always the realist, and Jefferson, the idealist, engaged in thoughtful debate until the very end. They discussed Plato, democracy, the Bible, and the French Revolution. They joked about old age and failing bodies. They remembered Abigail, Martha, and the cost of independence. In one letter, Jefferson wrote, "The generation which commences a revolution can rarely complete it. The architects must rest while others bring the structure to perfection." Adams replied, "You and I have lived in serious times, but we have known joy. I hope the world we leave will be a better one." Together, they made sense of the world they had changed, and in doing so, they helped define what it means to live with contradiction. Chapter XII, The Empire of the Mind. Jefferson believed in many revolutions, but the one he believed would last the longest wasn't fought with muskets. It would begin in the classroom. To him, education was the only sure foundation of the preservation of liberty. He argued that ignorance and democracy could never coexist. If the people were to rule themselves, they must be informed, cultivated, not just literate, but enlightened. He envisioned a society where every child, regardless of birth, could access knowledge, where education would not serve the elite but the republic, a citizenry of thinkers. To this end, his crowning achievement after leaving the presidency was the University of Virginia. Unlike the religious colleges of the time, UVA had no chapel, no theological faculty. It was secular, rational, liberal in the classical sense. Jefferson designed the layout of the campus himself pavilions, forming a U shape centered around a domed rotunda inspired by the Roman Pantheon. It was a temple of reason, open to all free white males of talent and virtue. The limitations on race and gender, of course, marked another contradiction. He believed that science, not superstition, should guide humanity, that facts, not fear, should rule policy, and that the future belonged to those who could think independently. Chapter 21, The Scientific President. Jefferson was, in many ways, America's first scientific president. He invented practical tools, a rotating book stand that held 5 books at once, a duplicating machine called the polygraph, and a cipher wheel for secret messages. He tracked weather patterns, studied fossils, dissected plants, and corresponded with naturalists. He was fascinated by everything from astronomy to architecture to agriculture. During the Lewis and Clark expedition, which he commissioned after the Louisiana Purchase, he gave detailed scientific instructions, mapped the rivers, identify new species, measure altitudes. He wanted America not just to expand its borders, but its knowledge. When the British burned Washington in 1814, it was Jefferson's donated library, his personal collection of enlightenment thought, that replaced the destroyed Library of Congress. In it were volumes of philosophy, math, law, and literature. "I cannot live without books," he once wrote. He believed a republic must be as curious as it is courageous. Chapter XXII, The Silenced Voices. And yet, as Jefferson expanded the intellectual reach of his nation, he kept silent on those whose minds and bodies were shackled. He argued that the enslaved were incapable of the same achievements biologically, intellectually. He overlooked the creativity, endurance, and resilience of those who labored for his comfort. But history did not remain silent. From the fields of Monticello, stories emerged. Isaac Granger, a blacksmith, remembered Jefferson's love for invention. James Hemings, trained as a French chef in Paris, brought European cuisine to Virginia's soil. Madison Hemings, the son of Jefferson and Sally, told his story in a powerful 1,873 interview that reshaped our understanding of Jefferson forever. They were not merely shadows in his journals. They were part of his life, his legacy, and his reckoning. Chapter 24, The Philosophy of Freedom. For Jefferson, freedom was not just a right, it was a process. He believed the mind must be liberated before the body, that superstition, monarchy, and dogma were chains no less real than iron. In his Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, he wrote, "No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief." It was revolutionary. It laid the groundwork for the First Amendment. It separated church from state. And it became one of the 3 accomplishments he asked to be engraved on his tomb. He wanted to liberate the mind. but in doing so, he failed to liberate all bodies. His vision of freedom, though groundbreaking for his time, excluded women, the poor, Native Americans, and enslaved people. Yet the seeds he planted would be harvested by generations far bolder than his own. Chapter 25. The republic he envisioned. Jefferson dreamed of a republic rooted in small farms, honest labor, and moral virtue. He feared the rise of cities, banks, and industrial power. He worried that the pursuit of wealth would eclipse the pursuit of wisdom. In letters, he warned of entangling alliances, corrupt corporations, and concentrated federal power. He saw America as a garden, not a battlefield, a place where the yeoman farmer, not the financier, would be king. Ironically, as the 19th century advanced, his fears came true. Industrialization surged, cities grew, the federal government expanded. His ideal of a self-sufficient agrarian democracy began to vanish. Yet, even in this transformation, his influence remained. Every debate about liberty, federal power, education, race, and equality bears his fingerprint. Chapter 26. The Lingering Shadows. 200 years after Thomas Jefferson's death, his name still provokes debate, reverence, and rebuke, admiration, and anger. Walk the streets of Washington, D.C., and you'll see his legacy carved in marble. Visit the Jefferson Memorial, and his words still thunder across the interior dome. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. But walk a little further into history and you'll find voices louder now than ever that ask, what of the tyranny of the body? What of the enslaved? What of the women? What of the native peoples displaced by westward expansion? Jefferson's legacy is not buried in Monticello. It is alive, contested, and complicated. In classrooms, courtrooms, and across digital spaces, Americans return again and again to his word-seeking guidance, reckoning with betrayal. Chapter 27. The modern debate. Statues of Jefferson have been both erected and removed. In 2021, the New York City Council voted to remove a statue of Jefferson from its chamber, citing his ownership of human beings. Activists argued that honoring his image without context was to ignore the pain of generations. Others pushed back, saying that to erase Jefferson was to erase a founding pillar of democracy itself. Historians called for context, not cancellation. They urged Americans to hold both truths: that Jefferson was a visionary whose ideas shaped the modern world, and that Jefferson was a slaveholder who benefited from and did not dismantle human bondage. This tension defines not just Jefferson but America itself. Chapter 28, the Declaration in the 21st Century. When Black Lives Matter protesters took to the streets, they carried signs quoting Jefferson: "All men are created equal." When immigrants fought deportation, when women marched for equality, when LGBTQ+ citizens demanded rights, Jefferson's declaration appeared again, reminding the powerful of promises not yet fulfilled. Jefferson gave America its most powerful standard and, in doing so, gave future generations a tool to challenge its own failings. He built the framework. Others would complete the house. In this way, Jefferson's words are both shield and sword, protecting liberty and calling out hypocrisy. Chapter XXI, the letters that never die. Today, the Jefferson-Adams letters are taught in schools. They are humanity-soaked in hope, doubt, love, and regret offers something rare, a model of intellectual friendship across division. In an age of digital rage and political tribalism, their correspondence feels revolutionary once again. They disagreed fiercely, they wounded each other, but they never stopped writing. In the end, they forgave. Jefferson's final words in his last letter to Adams were simple: "Your affectionate friend, Thomas Jefferson." In a republic still struggling with its soul, perhaps that too is part of the legacy, a reminder that we can disagree, fight, and still be bound by friendship, purpose, and country. Chapter XX. The inheritance of a nation. Jefferson once said, "The earth belongs to the living." He believed each generation must rewrite its own social contract. that no constitution, no law, no institution should be held sacred forever. All must evolve. And so Jefferson himself invites scrutiny. He dares the future to challenge him. He knew perfection was not his to claim. He only hoped to light the way. He was not the answer, but he asked the question, what does it mean to be free? Who is entitled to liberty? And how do we live with the weight of our contradictions? He left those questions for us, and we are still answering them. Chapter XXI, the man who dreamed in ink. Thomas Jefferson never led armies. He was no battlefield hero, no war general. His victories were written, not fought. And yet, his pen transformed a revolution into a philosophy. When he wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he did more than sever ties with the king. He imagined a new kind of human society, one where authority sprang not from birth or bloodline, but from consent, reason, and rights. That vision was both radical and incomplete. He sowed a field of liberty, but left weeds of injustice. He lit a lamp of reason, but dimmed it with silence on race and slavery. He believed in the dignity of manhood, failed to see all men as fully human. Chapter XXII, the founding paradox. Jefferson was not merely a contradiction. He was the first embodiment of America's founding paradox, that a nation could be born in the name of freedom while dependent on slavery. That equality could be declared, yet denied. He was not alone in that paradox, but he was its most eloquent voice and perhaps its most tragic participant. Monticello was both a palace of ideas and a plantation of suffering, his life both inspirational and uncomfortable, his words both liberating and limiting. Yet in accepting this complexity, we see him more clearly not as a flawless founder, but as a brilliant, burdened man wrestling with the very same dilemmas we still face. Chapter XXIE, Beyond the Statues. Today, Jefferson stands not only in stone but in every courtroom where justice is argued, in every classroom where freedom is taught, in every protest where equality is demanded. He lives in the Bill of Rights he inspired, in the universities he imagined, in the freedoms of speech, conscience, and belief he championed. But he also stands in the questions we ask of ourselves. Are we willing to confront the sins of our past while honoring the ideals that were born alongside them? Can we separate myth from man and still find something worth keeping in both? To study Jefferson is not to worship him. It is to engage with the story of America itself, a story ever torn between its noblest dreams and its hardest truths. Chapter XXIV, the final words. On his gravestone, Thomas Jefferson chose his epitaph. Author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. He left out President of the United States. It wasn't an oversight, it was a statement. Jefferson believed ideas were greater than titles, that words could outlive crowns and commands. He was right. His words, whether etched in marble or shouted in the streets, are still alive, still debated, still shaping the world. Chapter XXV, Epilogue, The Flame. In 1963, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and declared, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Jefferson's words. But King's voice, that is the Jeffersonian legacy, not a finished chapter, but a script still being written, a flame passed from generation to generation, sometimes dimmed, sometimes blinding, but never extinguished. And in the dance between his failures and his dreams, between who he was and who he longed to be, we find something enduring. Not a perfect man, but a vision worth wrestling for. Chapter 3XXY. The unwritten dialogues. Thomas Jefferson kept journals, sketches, and letters, but there were conversations he never recorded private debates that burned within him. One such internal battle was about the future of republics versus empires. As America grew westward, Jefferson feared it might one day become what it once opposed, a colonial empire oppressing rather than liberating. In letters to Madison and Monroe, he wondered aloud if expansion could be compatible with liberty. Could new territories be admitted without spreading slavery, without destroying indigenous nations? These were not idle thoughts. They haunted him. He once wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." It was not just guilt, it was prophecy. Chapter 20X. A global philosopher, though Jefferson never left the continent after France, his influence became global. In Haiti, revolutionaries fighting French colonialism quoted his declaration. In South America, Simón Bolívar the Liberator sought inspiration from Jefferson's ideas while drafting constitutions for Venezuela and Bolivia. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh paraphrased Jefferson's famous preamble in 1945 when declaring independence from France. "All men are created equal. The Creator has given us certain inalienable rights." Jefferson's ideas, like his country, escaped his control. Others adapted them to their struggles. He became more than an American figure. He became a symbol, a weapon in the hands of revolutionaries across centuries. Chapter XXVE, The Children of Silence. At Monticello, there were children who lived between two worlds, the children of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. They were neither fully enslaved nor fully free. They worked in the house, not the fields. They were educated, given lighter duties. Some were allowed to leave Monticello. Jefferson never publicly acknowledged them, but his actions spoke. Madison Hemings, in a detailed 1873 interview, described his father with both respect and realism. "My father," he said, "was Thomas Jefferson." He was not in the habit of showing partiality. Beverly, Harriet, Eston, and others carried Jefferson's blood into Black America. Many eventually passed into white society, leaving behind a surname and a secret legacy. Today, Hemings' descendants sit side by side with white Jefferson descendants at Monticello reunions. Their unity is a quiet rebellion against the silence of centuries. Chapter XXX, the presidents who followed. Every American president, knowingly or not, walks in Jefferson's shadow. James Madison, his closest ally, co-authored the Virginia Resolution defending states' rights. His presidency echoed Jeffersonian republicanism, but with deeper conflict during the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson admired Jefferson's belief in the common man, but twisted it into populism infused with aggression and Indian removal policies. Abraham Lincoln, although ideologically far removed from Jefferson's acceptance of slavery, referred to Jefferson as a colossal figure who gave the nation a moral compass through the Declaration. "All honor to Jefferson," Lincoln once said, "who had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth, which should be a stumbling block to all tyranny." Even Franklin D. Roosevelt, in the depths of the Great Depression, erected the Jefferson Memorial, positioning Jefferson as a New Deal era beacon of hope and democratic renewal. And in more modern times, Barack Obama, the nation's first black president, called Jefferson's ideals noble even as he acknowledged Jefferson's flaws. "His words gave me a place in this country," Obama said. Chapter XL, the struggle with immortality. In his final years, Jefferson worried not about his body, but his memory. He knew posterity would judge him. He tried to shape that judgment not by rewriting his actions, but by carefully selecting what to highlight. He wrote over 19,000 letters, each one a window into his evolving mind. He included philosophy, theology, inventions, and advice for future generations. He debated with Unitarians, criticized monarchies, defended democracy, but rarely, if ever, addressed the full injustice of slavery. He hoped to be remembered as a man of ideas, not controversy. But even the architect of Monticello could not control the rooms history would enter. Chapter XIE, the statues that speak and the ones that fall. In the 21st century, statues of Thomas Jefferson have become battlegrounds. Supporters say they honor a man who gave the world enduring ideas of freedom. Opponents say they glorify a slave owner who helped institutionalize racial inequality. At the University of Missouri, at the University of Virginia, and in New York, protests have demanded removals. In some places, Jefferson statues were quietly moved indoors, contextualized. In others, they were toppled outright. Yet many historians argue, don't erase Jefferson, explain him. Let his image stand next to Hemming's descendants. Let his words be read next to those of Frederick Douglass. Let his monument carry both praise and indictment, because perhaps no other founder better encapsulates America's promise and its paradox. Chapter Exili, the Testament of Silence. In his last days, Jefferson became quieter. His once constant correspondence slowed. He withdrew to his books, his garden, and his mind. He often stared out over the hills of Monticello in silence. Visitors described him as solemn but serene. His grandson noted how Jefferson, even in his final weeks, insisted on being updated about world news revolutions, elections, discoveries. But he never publicly addressed what many saw as his greatest moral failure. He died a statesman, a slaveholder, a scientist, a visionary, and a contradiction. And perhaps in that silence there was an unspoken admission. The republic he helped forge was still unfinished. Chapter XII, the university that became a monument. Jefferson once wrote, "This institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind." He was speaking of the University of Virginia, his final act of nation building. To him, this was not just a school, it was an incubator for democratic reason, a place where students would become citizens, not subjects. Today, UVA stands as both tribute and tension. Its architecture, still centered around the rotunda Jefferson designed, symbolizes classical reason. But its history includes segregation, exclusion of women, and modern struggles for equity. Yet it remains one of America's most prestigious public universities and a symbol of Jefferson's belief that education was the republic's true defense. Chapter US, the code of a scientific mind. Jefferson believed in knowledge as freedom. His days were structured with observation, experimentation, and discovery. He kept detailed records of weather, soil, the blossoming of trees, and the phases of the moon. He studied architecture as a language. His home at Monticello wasn't just a house, it was a living machine of Enlightenment symmetry. He welcomed fossils and native artifacts from the Lewis and Clark expedition. He tried to prove that American wildlife was not inferior to Europe's, challenging European scientists with data and logic. Even in theology, Jefferson used reason as his scalpel. He literally cut apart the Bible, removing miracles and mysticism, and compiled the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth, a book of ethical teachings stripped of divinity. He believed in a God of nature, not dogma, a divine force expressed through laws, not liturgy. Chapter XLV, the voice of the modern republic. Jefferson is quoted in every courtroom, on every campaign trail, in nearly every fight for justice, even by those who reject him. Civil rights activists invoked his words. Reformers attacked his legacy. Presidents praised his wisdom while contradicting it. This is the mark of true influence, and not that he is adored, but that he is unavoidable. In every generation, Americans return to Jefferson not for answers, but for confrontation. He is the country's oldest mirror, reflecting both what it claims to be and what it fears to admit. Chapter XLV, the man who outlived his time. Jefferson died in 1826. Yet, in 2026, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, his name will again echo across history. Debates will continue. Should his statue stand? Should his name be on schools? Should his story be retold, revised, or retired? But regardless of verdicts, his words will remain. They are tattooed into the nation's DNA. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. They are both compass, and indictment. They challenge America to live up to its founding fire. Chapter XLVI, the final paragraph. Thomas Jefferson was never simply a man. He was a paradox made flesh. A slaveholder who wrote of freedom, a revolutionary who feared rebellion, a visionary who failed to see everyone in his vision. But he gave America something powerful, a dream too large to fit even within himself. His gift was not perfection. His gift was provocation. A republic born in doubt and hope, still striving, still stumbling, still arguing beneath the dome of ideals he dared to imagine. Chapter XLVI, the land he claimed, the nations he displaced. For all Jefferson's love of liberty, his vision for America's expansion came at a cost paid most deeply by Native American nations. Jefferson believed that the American Republic must stretch from sea to shining sea. He called for what he termed a peaceful assimilation of indigenous peoples, encouraging farming, Christianity, and ultimately cultural absorption into white society. But behind the language of civilization lay a more forceful agenda, removal. He envisioned a frontier without resistance. If native tribes refuse to assimilate, he wrote, then we shall be obliged to drive them beyond the Mississippi. In letters, he used the language of paternalism and force interchangeably. The Louisiana Purchase, which he brokered, opened vast new territories, but also signaled the beginning of relentless westward displacement. The paradox deepened. The man who opposed monarchy endorsed expansion that would lead to the forced migration of entire nations. Chapter 1 selects the Republic of Property. Jefferson's democracy was rooted not in class, but in land. He believed ownership of land bred independence and moral strength. In a society of farmers, he said no man would need to bow before another. Land was the foundation of liberty. His vision helped inspire the Land Ordinance of 1785 and later the Homestead Act frameworks that gave ordinary white citizens access to land in the West. But that promise excluded women, the enslaved native peoples, and the landless poor. It made property the gateway to personhood, a dangerous precedent that would echo in voting laws, tax codes, and segregation. To Jefferson, land was not just soil, it was citizenship. But in tying liberty to land, he also tied it to exclusion. Chapter L, the Philosopher's Blueprint. Jefferson was never merely a political figure. He saw himself first as a philosophera student of Locke, Bacon, Newton, and Rousseau. He believed that truth was discoverable, not decreed. From this belief, Jefferson formed his republican ideal that the individual must always precede the state, that no government could be legitimate unless it protected rights that preceded it: life, liberty, conscience. These weren't just Enlightenment slogans to Jefferson, they were moral blueprints. In private letters, he debated the nature of good and evil. He read the Quran, dabbled in Hindu scripture, and questioned organized Christianity. To him, the human being was not born fallen, but born curious. It was this optimism that made his contradictions all the more painful. He envisioned the mind as sovereign, yet failed to emancipate those whose minds were legally and physically caged. Chapter Lee, the lost letters and historical shadows. Among the nearly 20,000 surviving letters Jefferson wrote, some are missing, burned, buried, or forgotten. Historians have long speculated about what might have been in the private correspondence between Jefferson and Martha Wales Skelton, his wife. Almost none of her letters survived. Some say Jefferson destroyed them out of grief. Others believe they were lost during the War of 1812. There are also gaps in his journals during his relationship with Sally Hemings, leading some to suspect self-censorship. And what of letters to or from enslaved persons? None remain, not one from James or Madison Hemings, not one from Isaac Granger. Did they write to him? Were their voices ever preserved? These silences are loud. They shape how we see Jefferson, not just by what he said, but by what he may have chosen never to say. Chapter Lee, Jefferson in modern imagination. In the modern world, Jefferson lives on not only in textbooks, but in story. He has been portrayed by actors in film and TV, from noble philosopher to tortured hypocrite. In Hamilton, the Broadway musical, he is a flamboyant, French-loving rival to Alexander Hamilton, charming but often self-serving. In novels, he's been both hero and villain. In political commentary, his quotes are used by both conservatives and liberals, sometimes in the same paragraph. Even in fiction, Jefferson reflects our current values, our conflicts, our need to grapple with contradiction. Each generation rewrites him not because he changes, but because we do. Chapter EI, Jefferson and the Law of Nations. Jefferson believed that natural rights did not end at national borders. He wrote extensively about international law, defending the sovereignty of young nations and condemning colonial empires. He feared entangling alliances, yet believed that republics should support other republics. In letters to leaders in Latin America, he encouraged constitutionalism and secular governance. He believed that monarchy was an outdated disease, infecting nations with stagnation and fear. His writings on liberty directly influenced democratic movements in Poland, France, South America, and Greece. But he also struggled with America's own hypocrisies. How could a nation claim moral authority abroad while allowing human bondage at home? That contradiction would eventually fracture the Union, but not the fire of the ideas Jefferson lit. Chapter 11, The Science of a Republic. Jefferson never stopped being a scientist. He was one of the earliest Americans to argue that science should inform government. He believed that laws should evolve like knowledge revised by discovery, not rigid by tradition. He supported vaccination against smallpox, he tracked climate patterns and studied crop rotation. He believed public health and agricultural science were as vital as politics. In a world of superstition and monarchy, Jefferson's belief that reason should rule was revolutionary. And today, in debates about climate change, medical freedom, or AI ethics, his vision of reasoned republics remains relevant. Chapter LV, The Final Mirror. As America enters new centuries, the mirror of Jefferson becomes sharper and more uncomfortable. He is the embodiment of national paradox. He wrote freedom but owned slaves. He preached reason but denied equality. He built a nation but excluded too many from its promise. But still, he gave the world a sentence that refuses to die. All men are created equal. It is not enough to quote it. It must be confronted, interrogated, expanded, and live. Chapter LY, The Republic. He couldn't finish. Jefferson once imagined that each generation should rewrite the Constitution. He believed no law should outlive the people it governs. That dream was never realized, but perhaps his truest legacy was that he made it thinkable. He planted the seeds of constant revision, the idea that freedom must always be unfinished, that the work is never done, that the American Republic must perpetually interrogate its solo risk losing it. Jefferson didn't build a perfect nation. He built a nation capable of becoming more perfect. And that perhaps is the greatest paradox of all.